Hi, everybody. This is episode 12 of the Church Chatter podcast, where we unpack a different church word or phrase each week. I'm Sam. I have my doctorate in language and culture, and I study religious linguistics.
And I'm Dillon. I have a master of...
We were just laughing right before this episode. We're not hitting pause. We're going to keep going. So go ahead, Joe.
Oh, my. And I'm Dillon. I have a master of divinity, and I'm an ELCA Lutheran pastor.
Okay, so this episode is episode 12, and it's all about the word inn. I-N-N, like a hotel. Like in the nativity scene, they were at an inn, right? So we're going to unpack what that word actually means and the ramifications it has. But first, I want to start with a story. So...
I'm sorry, we're giggly today, and we apologize for that.
We have big giggles today. So I want to start with a story. When I was in college, a gen ed requirement that I had, I actually told Dillon this story earlier, so I've told this story multiple times today. When I was in college, about 15 years ago, I had to take a gen ed, one of my gen ed courses. I had an option between sociology and anthropology. I chose anthropology because it meant I wouldn't have Friday classes my sophomore year, which was just unheard of for sophomores, so I was pretty excited. So I chose anthropology, which it's interesting because I actually teach sociology now, which is a course that I didn't even take in college, so that's really interesting. But I chose anthropology so I wouldn't have Friday classes, and I fell in love with anthropology, which I did not see coming. I loved it. I especially love the classes on feminism and linguistics, which is what I study now. It's what I have my doctorate in, is language and culture, so that's really interesting. But that's not the point of this story. I love studying humans and culture, and I had, so if you don't know, in anthropology, there's kind of four fields. There's linguistics, cultural anthropology, archaeology, and then there's something called physical anthropology, like forensic anthropology, where you study the human body and all kinds of stuff. And I had this physical anthropology class. My professor, I can picture him, but I don't remember his name anymore. He studied bipedal humans, so like humans who walk on 2 feet, which is most of us, right? So he studied just this concept of bipedalism. So again, bipedal. Dillon thinks that word is hilarious. The idea of walking on 2 feet. And he needed a bunch of students to help him with his research. So I signed up, and for many weeks, I would go into this like auditorium space, and he would have just all this paper, just like huge poster boards everywhere. And we would it's been a long day. We would dip our feet in paint, and we would just walk all over the place. We would walk frontwards, backwards, side to side, heel to toe. We would just walk in whatever way he told us to, because he was studying. I don't even really know the research focus that he had. I was 20 years old. I wanted to help him with research because I was interested in research. So I went and I helped him. Now, I had this boyfriend in college for 3 or 4 years. And one night he asked me to hang out, and I said I couldn't because I was helping my professor with his research. And my boyfriend and I won't say his name on here, we got into one of the biggest fights we had ever had. Now, again, I was 20 years old, but I told him about this research, and I thought it was so cool. And my boyfriend thought that it was so dumb. Why would anybody give their life to researching people walking on 2 feet? And I remember just this huge fight that we got into because I was defending my professor. It sounds so simple and maybe even silly to a lot of you listening, but for me, it broke something open in me. I just remember thinking that I thought it was so cool that my professor found something so specific, like bipedalism, that he was interested in, so he gave his life to it. He just wanted to learn about it. Why do we do this? How did it happen? Like, is it part of evolution? How has it helped us as people? When did it happen? Like, can we pinpoint when it happened in our evolution as a human species? All of it. He was just unpacking all of it. He dedicated his life to this very niche field. And I'm convinced that man, he was probably in his 50s or 60s at the time. I don't know. I was 20, so I thought everybody older than 25 was old at the time. But he was probably in his, 50s at the time. He had to have known that some people just didn't give a shit. Some people didn't care. Some people, like my boyfriend at the time, just thought that this research of this topic was just not interesting. Why would anybody pursue this path of knowledge? But I thought it was so admirable. And I remember deciding right then and there, I remember thinking, I'm not interested in bipedalism, but I'm going to find something that I'm that interested in and I'm going to give my life to it. I'm going to just go down the rabbit hole like my professor has. I'm going to research it. I'm going to write about it. I'm going to talk about it. I want to do that. I want to be interested in something like that. Little did I know I was already I was already on the path. I was already obsessed with language and all of that. I just didn't know it yet. I didn't have language for it, but here I am. I say that because this episode is about the word in. The nativity story goes that, long story short, we're really going to get into it, so Dillon can interrupt here too. Long story short, Jesus and Joseph and Mary went to the town of Bethlehem, and they were denied a room at the inn, right? So they had to go stay in this area with animals, yada, yada. But the word inn doesn't mean what we think it does. And the reason I told this story is because I think a lot of people, listen, I know that a lot of people are just not, some people aren't religious, so they don't care about religious language and translations the way Dillon and I do. A lot of people who are religious, they just want to keep their way of understanding the story, and that's fine too. But I like unpacking it. I like my professor 15 years ago in college, who really just wanted to understand everything about human beings walking on 2 feet, why that happened, when that happened, where it happened, how it happened. I too am interested in the details of this Christian story, and my door into the house of Christianity is the language. And this word in, and everything we're going to talk about in this episode, to some of you, you might think like, oh, who cares? Like it's not even a big deal. It doesn't even change the story. But I'm making the argument right here in the beginning of this episode. It matters. The way we understand in matters. And if you're not interested in unpacking it, that's totally fine. You can have your beliefs. I'm not dying on any hills today. But it's not just a silly 3-letter word. It deeply matters. It changes the way we picture things. Do you think that's a decent intro?
Well, I think that's a very good intro.
It's a long-winded intro, but here we go. Come closer so people can hear you. He's a little far. Or just talk loud.
I'm here.
Okay. I almost said, can everybody hear him? But this is a one-way medium. All right. I'm going to dive in. Do you have anything to add to the intro?
Nope. Go for it.
Okay. So the Christmas story in the Bible is read with a lot of Western assumptions, right? So we are all Western people listening to this, most likely. So firstly, we like to picture Mary and Joseph being denied a room at the inn, but this word inn actually has a very different meaning in the nativity story. So the Greek word for inn, so remember that Greek is an original biblical language, right? So the Bible was not originally written in English, and if you've listened to other episodes or been interested in any kind of biblical research, you always start there, right? It wasn't written in English. Nowhere close to it. At best, we have a paraphrase. So the Greek word for inn is, I'm hoping I say this right, pandoheion. That is not at all how it's spelled. It's spelled Pandocheion, if it's transliterated. So, pandoheion, which is used in the parable of the Good Samaritan also, but this is not the word. So this is the Greek word for inn, but this is not the word that is used in Luke to describe where Mary gives birth to Jesus. So the Greek language did have a word for inn, but it was not used in Luke to describe where Mary gives birth to Jesus. Instead, the word katalima is used, which means room or guest room. So again, just right off the bat, just the translation, Jesus' mother was not denied a room at the inn. She was denied a room, but nowhere in there is the understanding of inn. So even besides this translation, it's also important to understand that Bethlehem, where Jesus is said to have been born, was a very rural place. And a place like that, it was very unlikely that there was an inn there. People weren't visiting Bethlehem for work. And it's not like the world we know today where we live in a very small town and there's like places to stay overnight here. There's like bed and breakfast, hotel kind of places. That was not the world 2,000 years ago in the Middle East. Bethlehem likely didn't even have paved roads, right? It's very unlikely that they had an inn. So besides just the translation, culturally, there was probably not an inn there for them to even be denied a room at. So when people say, oh, if I owned the inn, if I owned the hotel, if I was the innkeeper, I definitely would have let Jesus in. I definitely would have let Mary in, right? I feel like we've all heard that in Christian circles. This is not a commercial inn as we understand it today. So she was not denied a room at the inn. Likely what it was a house that was simply so full that they were given a guest room. And this room happened to be a room where the animals were kept, because in rural areas in the Middle East at that time, families kept animals in a room in their home, in like the bottom floor. If you just Google it, you can see pictures of what these homes looked like. And animals were kept in a certain room in the house, kind of like this dirt floor room. And that is where the story tells us Jesus was born, where Mary gave birth. So it's not this innkeeper who denied a space in the inn. Many scholars actually make a really solid argument for Mary likely giving birth in the home of a family member, so in a room typically used for domestic cattle because the house was full. It is in the realm of possibility that they were not given a better room because Mary's pregnancy outside of marriage, remember she wasn't married to Joseph yet, this probably was a source of family shame and embarrassment, right? So it is possible, we'll never know. It is possible that Mary was denied a room in a family home because they were embarrassed. That's possible. Remember, hospitality was also a huge thing back then. So a lot of times people were sharing homes and giving rooms to family members and friends and things like that. So in addition to our common misreading of the word in our Christmas story in the nativity scene, the timeline, I actually want to pause. Do you have anything to add so far?
No, well, I do, but not at this point.
Not yet? Okay.
Not at this point, no.
Okay, so this is kind of a caveat. We're not going to dive into this too much, but in addition to our misreading of the word in our nativity scene in the Christmas story, the timeline of the Christmas story has also been misunderstood. So the Christmas story, as it's told in the Bible, it continues beyond Jesus's birth and into his first years of life. And us Westerners, we've kind of condensed this story into one scene where there's Mary and baby Jesus and Joseph and the Magi and angels and shepherds and animals and all of these things. We think that it all happened at once because we often think that biblical writers were writing in chronological order. You'll probably come to learn this as we do more episodes in the coming months and over the next year, but I'm obsessed with the notion of time and how the way we understand time today is not how a lot of biblical writers and people in the biblical stories understood time. So we often think that biblical writers were writing in chronological order with one recorded event happening right after the previous recorded event, but that's not reality. So in actuality, the Magi in the story, they don't come until years after Jesus' birth, and we're actually going to talk about that on the next episode. But this is actually not the biggest theological issue. It does change the way we tend to view the nativity scene. Let's just start here. Jesus was not born in isolation. He was probably born around family, right? A lot of scholars have made really convincing arguments that Jesus was born in a family house with family members around him when he was born with Mary. Anything else? I want to talk about Bethlehem next, but do you have other things to add about the word in?
Well, most scholars do believe, there was probably people around, but this room that was not, it was definitely not a hotel. It was definitely not an inn like the Country Inn and Suites or the Hampton Inn. It was definitely not that. But once again, the inn and the Greek word for inn really means, again, like Samantha said, a room in a person's house, particularly where they kept domesticated animals.
And doesn't that make it a lot more personal? So whenever people like to say, I definitely wouldn't have denied Jesus a room, I wouldn't have denied Mary a room at the inn. Okay, maybe you wouldn't have denied a room in a hotel, but would you have let a stranger into your home? Like, it's a lot more personal. Would you have let a stranger into your home? Or if it is a family member, maybe it's a distant family member, and they are unwed and pregnant and about to give birth, would you have let them into your home? It humbles us a little more. It's a lot more. It's our personal space, not just this business that we own with lots of rooms like a hotel. It's personal space. Are you going to let? Would you have actually? Like, let's just humble ourselves. Would we? I wouldn't have. And I'm sorry to say that, but I think it's true. I wouldn't have let a stranger into my home, into any room in my home, and said, sure, go give birth there.
Yeah, it does. It makes it much more personal, and we have lost that personalness through translation. Okay, it's always interesting to me. So I'm a Lutheran pastor, as many of you may know, and one of the great things that the church, regardless of the denomination, but what many churches do around Christmas time, usually on the Sunday before, whenever the 25th of December comes, most churches will do like a Christmas play, or they'll do a Christmas pageant, usually with children. And I know in the Lutheran Church we get all kinds of, nice little plays that are put together, and they have nice little parts and something. And there's usually always added characters. Usually there's an innkeeper, and once again, there wasn't an innkeeper in the Bible. And sometimes I was actually just at a funeral this morning. I officiated a funeral, and they were talking about the stories of them doing a Christmas pageant, a nativity story, and someone would play the role of the little drummer boy. Now, the little drummer boy isn't in the Christmas story, but there is the story and the song of the little drummer boy, which is very common at Christmas, and actually it's a beautiful, beautiful story. But so we have been adding to the nativity story for centuries. So things like drummer boys and innkeepers, and even up to, we're not going to get in detail because this is our next episode, but even up until up to the three magi, and we'll talk about that in our next episode. But this idea of the inn, not being a hotel, but being an actual extra room in a person's home, where either domesticated animals or kind of an outshed that was connected to the home, a room, would be in this person's personal home, filled with animals, and probably most definitely pretty smelly. Not a fun place to.
So the drummer boy is nowhere in the Bible.
Oh no, the drummer boy is nowhere in the Bible, and neither is the innkeeper.
Can we pause for a minute and just talk about the drummer boy song? That's sung in churches.
Oh yeah, and I'm going to talk about it. Please, if you're one of my parishioners, I'm going to give you a little preview. If you come to the 4:00 Christmas service on New Year's Eve, Christmas Eve.
No, this episode will be out after Christmas
Oh,
Eve.
that's right. You told me not to say that. Anyways, I'm going to talk about the story of the little drummer boy in one of my Christmas sermons, and. But the drummer boy doesn't show up anywhere in Scripture, but here's the thing.
So, just really quick, hymns. I think we've said this before, and we've got to have some episodes on hymns.
Oh, we have to. I love them.
Yeah, there's something about hymns that can get away with unbiblical messages in a way that a sermon never could. Right? Like if a sermon is delivered by a pastor, people are scrutinizing it. They're looking for something unbiblical there. And yet we sing these hymns, these old, some of them very beautiful hymns, even new songs, and they can say and add and interpret the Bible in some really radical ways, for the better or the worse, and people don't blink an eye. When it's put into metaphor and music, somehow people just don't care. There's something really interesting there with hymns and theology, and hymns can get away with anything almost. So interesting.
I think hymns are some of the most underutilized things in the church. I mean, if you go to a church that still sings hymns, some churches don't sing hymns. They
but
sing
even some of the newer
more
modern songs, theologically, they're interpreting Scripture in some interesting ways, but they can get away with it if they're singing it with a guitar or an organ.
Now, here's the interesting part. Me being a Lutheran pastor, the Lutheran tradition from the very beginning has never had any problems with hymns having things that are interpretations of the Scriptures or things that have been kind of added over time. The Lutheran tradition has a very rich history of hymns and hymnody that kind of expand on the biblical narrative. Now, if you grew up in a tradition that is more reformed and very, very strict reformed, like a Calvinist tradition, then you would probably be used to hymns that aren't adding anything. If it's not biblical, then it can't be in the hymn. So there's this. So there's both. There's always been both. There's ones that have kind of added and expanded on the understanding, and there's ones that have kind of taken a more narrow understanding of hymnody. For some very, very conservative Reform or Calvinist congregations or denominations, the only thing that they can sing is the Psalms. And so all of their psalms have been put to music in their hymnal, and that's the only thing that they sing. That's not so much the case for Lutherans.
Well, some people don't sing at all.
And some people don't sing at all. So
and if you're Orthodox, it's all singing.
Right. Well, it's more chanting, but
yeah.
So I don't want to get off this, but I want to say a couple things here. Samantha did a great job doing an intro and giving you a good kind of basis of the literacy around room and inn and what does that mean. And so here's the interesting thing. If you go to church every week, once a month, let's say you just go on Christmas, right? In most churches, liturgical churches and non-liturgical churches, when you go to Christmas, you will hear one gospel read and one gospel read only, and that's the gospel from St. Luke, right? And that is the gospel in which we hear the story of Jesus and Mary and Joseph and the angels and surrounded by the manger and wrapped in swaddling clothes and what is the old traditional language, and lying in a manger. So for most people, when they think about the Christmas story, they think about St. Luke's gospel and St. Luke's gospel only, right? And out of all four gospels, the Christmas story is only in two of them, in St. Luke's gospel and in St. Matthew's gospel. And if you go to church on Christmas Eve or Christmas Day, you will never hear St. Matthew's gospel read. And if you read it, it is still Mary and Joseph, it's still the baby Jesus, but it looks a little different and it sounds a little different. It is not what we are used to and what we think culturally about the Christmas story that we get from the Gospel of St. Luke. So, St. Luke's Gospel is read on Christmas Eve or Christmas Day, and St. Matthew's Gospel, we read the portion of the birth narrative about the coming of the Magi or the three kings or the wise men, okay? And St. Matthew's Gospel doesn't speak of Jesus being born in a manger at all. Isn't that interesting? It says nothing about Jesus being born in a manger. It says that he was born in a home. It doesn't mention the inn at all. It's nowhere to be found. That's nowhere to be found. That there was no room in the inn, or there was no room in someone's house, and so they had to go out to the stable or the outpost or the shed or the place where the animals or this kind of extra room. It says nothing about that in St. Matthew's Gospel.
Well, and whenever it says in some translations that they had to go where the animals are, again, with our Western eyes, because we're familiar, especially if you're in like rural United States, we think that a shed or a barn is something separate from a house. Back then, architecturally, animals were kept in the home, not like in the living room, but there was a space in the home where the animals were. So it's not this separate thing. We like to picture it that way, but that's not how it was.
Correct. And let me go back to what I was saying before with some Christmas pageant stories where there's like extra characters. I don't, as a Lutheran pastor, I don't have any problem with that. I think I think if you have an innkeeper in your Christmas pageant story, or you have a little drummer boy, that can only enhance the story. I don't think that takes away from it. But
We're not making the argument that we should get rid of nativity
oh
scenes.
Lord,
For
I
sure
love them.
not. Keep them.
We
Yeah.
have many of them, and I love them. And if anybody, if you're a parishioner and you listen to this, and I've been your pastor for a couple of years now, you know that I love to play around with the nativity, especially the magi, and move them all around and do things, is a very, very important part of the story of preparing for Jesus's birth in Advent, and then the coming of Jesus's birth at Christmas, for all 12 days of it. So, but it's interesting because we think that there's only one story, right? So we think that there's only one Christmas story, and that's not true. There's at least 2 stories about the Christmas story in Luke's gospel and in Matthew's gospel. And the other interesting thing is, in Luke's gospel, you get the shepherds. The shepherds come. The angel comes to the shepherds and says, I bring you good news of great joy that's for all people. And on this day, in the city of David, a Savior, the Messiah, Christ the Lord, will be born, right? And the shepherds go, and they go to the manger, and the shepherds meet the baby Jesus and Mary and Joseph in the manger, right? That's pretty much what we understand. So you get the shepherds in Luke's gospel, but you don't get the magi. You don't get the wise men. You don't get the 3 kings. They are nowhere to be found in Luke's gospel. You have to go to Matthew's gospel there. And if you read Matthew's gospel, you will see that's where we get to the part in which we understand of the magi coming, the 3 magi of gold, frankincense, and myrrh, right? But you won't find any shepherds in Matthew's gospel. They don't exist. They're not there. They're not part of the story, right? And so it's interesting because many people, at least 2 people, are telling the same story, but from different angles, right? Luke's talking about these poor, lowly shepherds that are going to see the baby Jesus, and people of poverty going to Jesus, one who is being born in along with the animals, right, in this room where it's not like a typical room of other people, right? And then in Matthew's gospel, you're getting kind of these highfalutin, affluent astrologers and people from the Far East coming, these kind of magisterial people to honor who? The Christ child, the king, the newborn king. So you get kind of Luke's gospel that is talking about poverty, Jesus being born in poverty in an outdwelling room
As an outsider
with the shepherds there, kind of people in poverty. Luke is really, really concerned with people in poverty and how Jesus's birth and message at Christmas is uplifting the poor. Matthew's gospel, very different. Matthew's gospel is telling a story of the newborn king, the Messiah that the Jews were awaiting. And with that, there are other kingly and magisterial type people coming to honor the newborn king. Matthew's gospel is trying to say people in high places are coming to honor the newborn king. Luke could care less about people in high places. And Matthew wants to say, no, it's people in high places that are coming to a person who's born, what? Not in a manger, but in a normal house. A normal house.
Once again, we see power structures at play.
You see total different power structure. And
that's actually a good segue into what I want to talk about next.
Lovely, because I don't have anything else to say. Anything more to say.
Okay, so let's talk about Bethlehem. So this supposed guest room, right, was in Bethlehem. So let's talk about this location of this guest room in Bethlehem. Jesus was born... Now, listen, stay with me, y'all. It's going to get political, but we got to go there. We have to go there. I think that's the power of this story. It has to be said. This guest room was in Bethlehem. Jesus was born in Bethlehem, which was in the region of Judea. Judea was born Judea was in a territory that was no longer under Jewish rule, but instead it was under foreign rule. So imagine if you are in Judea and it's under Jewish rule, and all of a sudden the Roman Empire comes in and takes over, right? We see this on the global landscape all the time, right? So it's under foreign rule. King Herod was the ruler of Judea. So Judea was no longer under the power of the Jewish people. It was taken over. King Herod was in charge. He was the ruler of Judea. Jesus's family, along with Jesus, who had to flee to Egypt to escape King Herod's order to kill all male infants in Bethlehem. This happened, we celebrate it on December 28th, what is it called?
The Feast of the Holy Innocents.
Which is our oldest daughter, who's almost 4. That's her birthday. So she was born on the Feast of the Holy Innocents when all these male infants were supposedly killed, which is just really sad to even think about. But so Jesus's family and Jesus had to flee to Egypt to escape King Herod's order. So they had to flee their land, Bethlehem, Judea. They had to flee to another nation, to Egypt, to escape being killed. This is the story of an immigrant. So we have to talk about immigration here. We have to. If you're a Christian, you have to wrestle with it. You have to reconcile it with your story, with the Christian story somehow. The Jesus story, the birth of Jesus, the Jesus story begins with Jesus and his family fleeing their land because it was unsafe for them to be there. So when we hear people saying, oh, would you have let Jesus and Mary would you have let Mary into the inn? Or would you have been the innkeeper? First of all, inn doesn't mean inn. It wasn't a business. It wasn't a commercial property. It was an intimate home. Furthermore, the bigger question is, are you letting people in now to your personal space? That's the Christian message, I'm convinced.
I'm totally with you.
Right. Because the Jesus story begins with Jesus and his family. They are immigrants fleeing their land because they are unsafe. Jesus is a target. They want to kill him. It is unsafe for him and his family to be there, so they flee. The Christian story is intimately connected to immigration. To be a Christian must mean that we see both the humanity and the divinity in people who are unsafe fleeing their land to our land. So the question for us Christians, if we're going to take this nativity story seriously, if we're going to take this Christian story seriously, if we're going to take the Bible seriously, do we make our ethics work around our systems, or do we make our systems work for our ethics? That's the question that we should all be wrestling with. And I'm not arguing like just anything goes. We can have a conversation about immigration reform, but the rhetoric revolving around people who are fleeing their countries or people who are looking for a better life, we can't just say things like, oh, they don't belong here. Like that rhetoric can't belong, especially if you are a Christian, because our Christian story, the person that we call God incarnate, was an immigrant fleeing his own land for survival, to thrive, and to live a better life. It matters.
It matters. Deeply
it matters.
Yeah.
Once again, the Christian story is political. We can't get away from it. So if you are somebody who has found yourself saying things that you shouldn't have, and listen, in my early 20s, I did it too. But I've learned better. The Christian story has transformed me. We don't get to do that. So if you're asking yourself, would I have let Jesus into the inn? The better, more relevant, more practical question is, am I letting people into my personal space now? Even if it's uncomfortable and difficult and dangerous for me, am I doing it now? Because we can do it now. Woo!
Well, that was powerful.
I think it matters, and it's connected to this word "in."
That was powerful. I do want to say one thing about that.
Sure.
Once again, I agree with you 110%. You cannot listen. You can't
go to church on Christmas Eve and listen to the story and think it was only 2,000 years ago. It's happening now too.
Right. You cannot disconnect the Christmas story told to us specifically in St. Luke's Gospel and St. Matthew's Gospel for that matter, but particularly St. Luke's Gospel, the Gospel that we always hear read on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. You cannot disconnect that from the current, past, and even going into the future understandings and policies and philosophy and theology around the immigrant and the refugee. Jesus and Mary and Joseph were indeed immigrants and refugees having to flee for their life and go somewhere else in hopes that someone would take them in and allow Jesus to be born, the one who we call the Christ, the Messiah, the Anointed One, the one who we follow as Christians. And so those two things, immigration and refugees, cannot be disconnected from the Christmas story. We're called, especially at this season of love and giving, just as Jesus gave his life for something new to show us a new way. We have to be cognizant of people who are fleeing and immigrants who are in a foreign land who need our care and our love. And again, you can't disconnect that. Here's an interesting thing, though, I've been thinking about real quick before we wrap up. For those individuals who might listen to this podcast that are interested in Old Testament or Hebrew fulfillments of Scripture or prophecy, the Old Testament prophets, the Hebrew prophets, prophesying and proclaiming that the Messiah would come, the Anointed One would come. In terms of the inn and that whole concept about the inn, there is nothing in Matthew's gospel or Luke's gospel and trying to connect that to Old Testament things. There's no prophecy that fulfills that. That is a New Testament understanding of things in a Roman oppressive world in which people writing 30, 40, 50 years after Jesus and telling Jesus' story, telling Jesus' birth story in Luke and Matthew, understood that this was indeed a problem, that there were people fleeing from their homes and babies were trying to be born, and this was a part of the story of Jesus. And it is very, very clear and made very clear in the New Testament, but in terms of a Hebrew or Old Testament prophecy, that this had to be part of the story, that is not a part of it. So that's important to note. And Matthew's gospel is the gospel that is most concerned about fulfillments of the Hebrew scriptures. And even in that, we don't even get the concept of the inn. We don't get that as part of the story. That doesn't mean that it wasn't true. That doesn't mean that it doesn't matter. But there's this idea of people. There's people out there, and God love you if you do this. That's great. But there's people, well, it has to be connected here, and it has to be connected here, and it has to be in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, and it has to be in the New Testament. Well, if you're trying to look for that one, that's not going to work with the nativity story because that doesn't match up. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So, in conclusion, I know I'm talking in circles, but I really care about this. A lot of people like to think that if they lived 2,000 years ago, they would have never denied Jesus a room at the inn. They will say, they just love Jesus so much, but they love him from a distance of 2,000 years, right? It's easy to love somebody from a distance of 2,000 years. They have their personal relationship with Jesus. Yes, beautiful. But instead of asking ourselves if we would have denied Jesus a room at the inn, which we all know was likely a guest room in a regular house, a better question is, are we going to continue denying people in need today? Or will we become the outsider? Will we welcome the outsider into our homeland in the name of Jesus? Are we going to love Jesus from a distance of 2,000 years, or are we going to love other people in the name of Jesus because Jesus taught us how to do that? So will we share our home? And by home, I don't just mean our dwelling, our house, but our nation, our resources.
Our church,
our spaces. Will we share that with people in need? Because we can't go back 2,000 years ago and prove whether or not we would have let Mary in to give birth to Jesus, God incarnate. We can't go back and prove that to ourselves and to other people. But we can prove it right now, right? And the way our society is set up in this kind of globalism landscape is we can create policies now. We can make our policies work for people and not the other way around. We can do that now.
I agree. Just as we close here in our next episode, you will. I'm going to talk about a historic a religious practice in the Christian tradition, mostly in the Western Christian tradition, but some in the East do it. This idea of really making a public profession. We want to talk about personal relationships and public professions. In our next episode, as we talk about Epiphany and the Magi, we're going to talk about a very specific ritual that is connected to the Magi and welcoming the Magi as Jesus welcomed, Jesus and Mary welcomed them into their home in the Gospel of Saint Matthew.
Perfect. All right. Be sure to listen next week. New episodes come out each Sunday. And you can follow us on Instagram at church_chatter_podcast. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.